I met Ayman at McGill School of Urban Planning, where we both studied in the same program. He was always inviting with a big smile and exudes positivity. I became impressed by his stunning graphics and creative skills. He seems to always be working hard and being passionate about his output. Ayman's originally from Lebanon and has degrees in architecture and real estate from the University of Beirut and from NYU. He now lives in Toronto and works as an urban designer in city planning for Mississauga. Most recently, he's launched an initiative to help raise money for his home country of Lebanon. He's highly motivated, accomplished, and inspiring. So please welcome Ayman to today's show. I guess I kind of wanted to know about your past and kind of how you got to where you are now. So maybe starting from your first trip into North America, like what made you come to North America to study in the US first and then here in Canada where you continue to live and work?
The first time I came to North America was actually on a school trip. We had just finished a course on modern art and architecture, so our professor took us to New York. From an academic perspective, so I went to an American university, so like the system and the structure is very much similar to an American university. It's a liberal arts university. I was looking at different programs, and then I saw the one at the planning program at McGill, and I already started developing interest in planning while I was doing architecture and real estate development as well. Planning program at McGill had like this real estate component, and I thought it was an interesting program. And I didn't want to stay in Beirut because I kind of already did some of the planning courses as well. And during my undergrad, I applied to a few universities and then ended up at McGill. This is how I ended up in North America.
Yeah, and then being at NYU, was that prior to McGill?
Oh yeah. While I was still doing my undergrad, I did a certificate program at NYU because I know I was interested in real estate and I wanted to know more about it and see kind of what that field entails. And I also knew to some extent, if I wanted to apply to a grad school later on, having that experience will let me know what kind of program I want to get into on one hand. Also the experience of, the academic and the personal experience of going kind of out of Lebanon was kind of what was appealing. And I had a summer off, so I just went and did it. It was a 6-week summer intensive at NYU. So I did that as well. And that really actually helped me figure out what I want to do later on.
And is that, I know talking about leaving Lebanon and stuff, it seems like that's a thing that a lot of people do. Like there's a big kind of expat community of Lebanese people. And is that true? And how has that affected the country? Or is it kind of something you'd already thought about even as a kid? Like, okay, I'm going to get out of Lebanon.
I started thinking about leaving Lebanon maybe halfway through my university time. My family's there and all of that. The reason why there are so many Lebanese people abroad is that we get this really high quality education in Lebanon, and then we're okay, we want to apply it. And then just the general environment does not really allow you to excel, or there isn't really much appreciation for talent, let's say that. Because the economy on one hand, just the way the country is structured, it's less about your skills and competencies more than about who you know. There is that, and there's also throughout Lebanese history and the history of the region actually, there were multiple wars. Or there was a civil war in Lebanon, different kind of forces that made people emigrate at some point or at different points. So there were different waves of immigration. North America was one of them. Also a lot of Lebanese people in South America. They say there are more Lebanese people outside of Lebanon than in Lebanon.
How do you think that's impacted the country though? I know I've heard a lot of the term of this idea of the brain drain, right? Kind of the educated people leaving a country and then leaving no one to take care of the actual kind of country, right?
Yeah, so I remember once I was attending a lecture by an economist at AUB. AUB is my undergrad university. And he said Lebanon is known for two things, exporting talent and a very good banking sector, which we now know is not really strong sector because it recently kind of collapsed. We have very good universities. I remember that economist saying something which is purely financial. He's it's not a smart investment for someone to study at a private university or a university in Lebanon and work in Lebanon. So we tend to export a lot of brains or a lot of talent. That definitely impacts the country negatively because the best talent tends to leave. On the other hand, from a banking perspective, going back to that economist, what he was saying is that because the banking sector was perceived to be very good, all this brain drain brings back money into the country. So that fuels, or kind of that really supports the banking system. There was that kind of thing, that kind of like support that expats do for Lebanon, but because it's so corrupt, as we were finding, like we've always known that, but the banking sector we're finding is even more corrupt now. Yeah, and people see that, and when people see that, it drives them to go away.
So I was interested in this, like you're kind of doing this thing, right, of raising money for back home in Lebanon. So maybe you could just give us a bit about kind of the idea behind it and, how did this actually come about to being an actual thing?
Yeah, so for the past, I think it's been more than a year, the situation in Lebanon has been going from bad to worse. Pinnacle of it was the explosion that happened on the 4th of August. We've been following the situation, and it started with, first of all, like a revolution, and then COVID, and then the currency, because of the banking sector, the currency's value deteriorating, having hyperinflation, all of that. So the situation was getting worse and worse until that explosion happened, when it was like kind of like the ultimate thing. So I was feeling very helpless, kind of guilty as well, because you do get these feelings of guilt, like I'm not there to help out. I survived, like the survivor's guilt. So there was that component. And I was having this discussion, I remember, with a friend of mine, he's also Lebanese, having another discussion kind of about what should we do, what can we do, with two other Lebanese friends of mine. All of us, we were kind of like tiptoeing around that idea of selling something, a product, something to raise funds. We also saw that because of this, the situation was really bad, a lot of artists were expressing themselves through art. So we thought of creating this online store which will amplify these voices through making that artwork not just artwork, but becoming more of an object that can be sold and all of, and then raising funds which we can use to help the NGOs on the ground. There is this thing, like it's a thing called empathy fatigue. Like I was talking with a friend of mine, like there's so much happening in the world right now. You get this like empathy fatigue. So for people to be motivated, or even for like talking from a personal experience, to be motivated to donate, it's not the easiest thing. You're just so overwhelmed, and we're like, okay, if you can get something out of it, that's an incentive. Like if you can get a nice t-shirt, a nice mug, or this product, then that's definitely an incentive, and it's more fun. It shifts the discourse as well from just having please donate on this link, something more interactive, something people can relate to more. And so far it's been good. We're hoping to continue developing it, having more products or new artwork. We'll see how people respond to that and adapt to it, and that's been a learning experience as well.
So you see it as continuing to and developing, or like what sort of view do you have for it?
We're waiting for the 1 month launch to kind of like announce how much we've donated and all of that, and trying to move it to the next step. But we do see it as something that's going to stay long term. As long as people are interacting positively with it, it could be a good way to support Lebanon, and specifically like NGOs, because like money can go to the government, and then we know that money disappears because everyone is so corrupt.
I don't really know the situation that well, like in Lebanon, but you mentioned there was some sort of revolution, or I know even in the past too, there's been kind of uprisings and stuff. But how is the situation like today?
The uprisings have now calmed down, because I think people are just too busy getting by for them to even think. And then there's COVID as well. So the protests started before COVID, and then COVID came, the country went under lockdown. The situation in Lebanon has always been very bad. There's always been a lot of corruption, but what sparked the revolution was wildfires that started, and then they had the firefighter jets, but they were not maintained, so they were not able to respond to the fires. So that really sparked a lot of public anger, because the money was there, and then they said that they maintained those fire jets, but they didn't. And then they wanted to impose further taxes and making the living situation even more expensive. So that people were really, really angry, and then took it and went to the streets to express that. I don't think this a revolution or uprising of this magnitude happened since 2005, which was the assassination of a Lebanese prime minister. That's another whole story. Yeah, so the situation has always been not that great, but then so the revolution came, and then people had hope. Were even in Lebanon and abroad expressing their disapproval towards this government, which is basically the same warlords that started the civil war. They're still the same people, still ruling. So this is the fundamental issue. It's hard to really summarize it, because there are so many aspects to it. In a nutshell, it's a corrupt system that's very sectarian, and it's ruled by the same warlords that destroyed the country in the 70s. It's still here. So the revolution's against these people. And then it's the same people that were kind of complicit in storing the ammonium nitrate that exploded in the port and caused the Beirut explosion. That's kind of the root of the problem. And then people are trying to change that, but it's not that simple because there is like geopolitical powers involved as well. It's not just these people. And Lebanon's location is very strategic, especially the Beirut port. So it's not an easy thing to wrap your head around.
But I want to get back to the idea, because you mentioned it, but I was kind of thinking it beforehand when I was writing these questions, like this idea of having all these expats and having some level of like guilt involved too, because
Yeah.
you see all these things happening back home and it's like, what can I do? Like I've left here. So do you see that being something else that your kind of peers experience too? And like, what is the best way to like go about dealing with that?
And I've had this conversation with different friends because most of my friends like from university are abroad, or Lebanese friends that I met here. There is this kind of feeling of guilt, survivor's guilt, but also feeling helpless. So you feel a bit guilty. The guilt is kind of a coping mechanism. It's one way to process this. So you don't know what to feel. So you feel guilty and angry. I remember the day of the explosion, I was seeing pictures, I was seeing videos, trying to wrap my head around it, but I couldn't process it very well because I'm in my situation, my immediate surrounding. So it's hard to process. Even the inability to process makes you feel guilty as well. But this is my personal way of dealing with it. You need to establish certain kind of boundaries and disassociate at some point and know what you can do, what you can't do. And so with QUMI, it was like, I can't do anything there because I'm here. And like it helps to rationalize emotions in general, but these feelings of guilt, really rationalizing them really helps. And it was productive because it led to something that is positive. That experience, many of my friends were having.
I wanted to get to know a bit more about how you kind of made that move into urban planning. But I know you studied architecture, so there's some overlap in terms of physical space, and main difference being kind of the scale of projects. As I understand it, kind of architecture is scale of like a building, and urban planning is bigger. So how was that transition like for you, going from architecture and then into planning?
It all started when I was studying architecture. The program that I was in had a lot of social component to it. It wasn't just like purely a design program. I had these discourses about equity, about the city, about the situation of architecture as part of a wider system of production. So I had that exposure on one hand, but then from a personal experience, like sometimes I would be like going through this city and I realize in Beirut, so I would realize there are different nuances to the built environment. Things as little as how certain streets are kept, certain streets are not well kept. So I started seeing that there is this added dimension to architecture. And if you approach it purely from an isolated design process, it's not really relevant. From that kind of experience, I started having more and more interest in urbanism and urban planning, and in understanding buildings not just from like kind of an architecture perspective, but also linking them to other processes in the city. And then when I started doing my internships and then working in architecture, that was like when my frustration with architecture reached kind of its maximum, I would say, because I realized everything you're learning at school is not necessarily relevant. There's this quote that I read once. It says like, you're in architecture school, you're trained to be a brain surgeon, but then you end up practicing as a hairdresser. I feel like that's a good way of putting it, because when you're studying in architecture school, you think you're going to know everything. Well, you do know everything. You are told that you're the person behind everything that's going to go in the building. It's from the interior to the exterior to the mechanical units and all of that. But then when you start working, you realize that the developer gives you like a table of areas and tells you, okay, this is the site, make it fit here. And then when you're done, make it look pretty. And that kind of dissonance between what I was hoping I'd do and what I would be actually doing was very frustrating. And this is why I slowly transitioned into urban planning. I realized I can influence the built environment, but from a more practical approach. I realized, I'm more interested in the kind of the bigger scale of things and how they influence the building. And I think that's what urban planning is.
Having worked now at the municipal level and as like a urban designer, urban planner, like are there any things you see too now where you're like, I studied this and then there's kind of a dissonance between the practice too, or?
Not as much as architecture, at least. When you're working as an urban designer from a municipality, you're seeing things from the other end. You do have more control to some extent than when you're working as an architect. But there's always the financial aspect. When you're working in a municipality, so I work in design and development. So we are working with development applications that are there to be built. It's not theoretical. So for them to be built, they need to make financial sense. So it's way, way more practical than when you're working as in an architecture studio when you're not sure if the project is going to be built. So in a municipality, it's more about getting things done, which I find very interesting. Comparing that to like urban planning school, I think it's more related or more relevant. Like the planning program is way more relevant to working in a municipality or getting things done than architecture. Although in the planning program, sometimes it's too idealistic. I feel like sometimes the social agenda is ideal, but in real life, it doesn't necessarily translate, unfortunately. And it's not something that planners or urban designers or architects do. It's a higher level of government that needs to control these things like affordable housing and social housing.
And I guess in a way from the municipal level, you're almost kind of, in some cases, like making the guidelines, whereas when you said as an architect, be given something, it's like, okay, I got to fit it within all these things. But if you're on the government side or like municipal side, you said on the other end, so you're deciding what sort of guidelines or frameworks to put in place, right?
Yeah, like this is what we'd like to see, even through the urban design process. So there's the guidelines component, like this is what we'd like to see. And then there's actual review of the application where like, we don't see this here, fix this. It's always a discussion. It's always a back and forth. It's never simple or never straightforward, which is part of the profession, which is what makes it fun, is that dynamic nature of it, especially on more complex projects where there are multiple professional opinions. For example, when we have large-scale projects, and I know municipalities across the GTA do this. I don't know if it's across Ontario, but for sure in the GTA, they have like urban design advisory panels. It's very important. They get professionals from architecture, landscape, and sometimes engineers as well are there. So they give their professional input on this application because there are different perspectives to it, and then seeing what works best. So sometimes you have to bend the rules a bit and you get variations from what you expected in your vision, because when the shovel hits the ground, you're going to get a different outcome.
Along the similar line, but like in terms of your work and just your view on sustainability, getting towards a sustainable society in general and having our cities and our communities being the way we organize them, it's kind of an important link in that or part of that. So how do you approach sustainability and what role does it have in your work, but also just maybe in your life too? Is it something you believe in?
From a planning and a development perspective, when I was doing my research project, which studied sustainability, I was kind of approaching it purely from a planning perspective, but there's more to it than just what planners think, what planners want. There are many different components. I remember when I was doing my project, there was the triple bottom line analysis where you're looking at the environment, the society, and the economy. If a project is sustainable, it meets or contributes to all of these three bottom lines. When I started working, I realized that each one of them is a whole department. So each one is responsible for different kind of components of that project. It's a very complex thing. I'm working now on green development standards. The City of Mississauga develops them to meet our own environmental goals. There are associated social and economic aspects to it, but we're focusing on the environmental part. Other city departments work on, for example, affordable housing, which is considered more of a social thing. So they're doing research on that, trying to find ways to get it done. So it's very complicated, but because it's part of like the strategic vision that the city has, it kind of all funnels down to different departments. From a personal perspective, I feel like sustainability is not something that you can tackle individually. Like you can reduce your consumption of plastic, eat less meat, buy this more sustainable product. But I don't think it's the consumer that should be making these decisions. It should be more, because it's so small. It's hard for you to calculate these things. You might think you're doing something that's more sustainable, but it's not necessarily more sustainable. And sustainability is such a vague concept as well. Like, for example, I was thinking the other day, like I bought the Beyond Meat burgers and I thought they're like, okay, I'm eating less meat. This is more sustainable. But then I look at the amount of plastic that this comes and paper and all of that. I was like, okay, what is the embodied carbon footprint or the impact of me consuming a burger? You know, like it's such a small thing, but it applies to everything. So if it's not something strategic, so back to this idea of like green and sustainability being a strategic pillar of a municipality's approach, that's how it gets implemented. The responsibility should not be for the individual developer or the individual person. It's just too hard to really make all these calculations. But you do what you can do, I guess.
Yeah, so in that case, the responsibility is really who is it with? It's like the governments, the companies, the people that have a bigger impact. How do you think we fit in though to that? Ultimately, we need bigger change on like a higher order level.
There was this Netflix documentary, I think it's called Broken. They're talking about plastic in general, but they talk about recycling. And when recycling became a thing, it was funded by Coca-Cola because they wanted to switch from glass to plastic bottles. They didn't want people to think that, oh, plastic is this bad thing. So they shifted the responsibility to the consumer. And they started funding these recycling campaigns because it's your responsibility as a consumer to recycle, not our responsibility as a corporation to be giving you a better solution. I think this really reflects part of the problem. There's a shift on the consumer to do kind of more sustainable things or choosing the greener product, which is usually more expensive. So if people can't afford it, should you put blame on them, or is it, how do you solve this problem if it's not something that's applied to everyone or to everything, more than just individual choices?
Talking about the pandemic, and have there been any things that you've started to do or that you started to do during the pandemic, habits or things kind of in day-to-day life that you might have started during then and then stuff that you continue to do?
Well, working from home is one of them, which is a big adjustment. But I remember that one of the things that I was doing a lot at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were still like under complete lockdown and no one was like really knew what was happening. I was living in Mississauga then. I was far away from all my friends. I wasn't really gonna use public transit or go in an Uber or just because I still didn't know like kind of these things. It was very isolating. So one way of like dealing with this, I was interested in cooking always, but now I took it to another level where I was doing more complex recipes. Every weekend, like I was instead of like planning an outing, I would plan the recipe that I would make or this complex thing. So that was kind of interesting. I've learned a few skills there, which I definitely still use.
I know you're into cooking and you have a lot of different passions and stuff. So how did this kind of love of cooking start, or what inspires your cooking in general? Like, is there any drawing from even your Lebanese roots or Lebanese cuisine, or like how do you approach making a meal just for yourself? Sometimes I feel kind of indulgent to like make this crazy meal and it's just me that's eating it.
My interest in cooking started when I was very, very young. My mom used to cook a lot. That always influenced me. So I was I was always interested. I had an appreciation for a home cooked meal, I guess. But I remember once I was home alone, and when I was maybe 9 or 10, I was very young, and I was watching a movie, something on TV, and I saw someone making fresh pasta. Wow, this is what I'm gonna do. And I remember I started I opened a recipe book that my mom had, and I made fresh pasta when I was 9 or 10. My mom was not impressed because of all the mess I made. Yeah, when I started working out, I started being more involved with meal prep. I was interested in more how I can make something that's healthy and all of that. This is kind of where it started, but then I got into baking. I feel like that works a lot like my brain. It's very structured. There's a process. There are different nuances. It's just a very interesting process for me. That's what I really enjoy. I enjoy baking more than cooking. Cook to survive. I bake for fun. Yeah, it's kind of that measured approach to things. It's just a very kind of relaxing process. Oh, you asked if it's related to Lebanese cuisine or Lebanese being Lebanese. Not necessarily, actually. I do love Lebanese food, and that's one of the reasons why I cook, for example. If I want to eat something Lebanese, if I go to a restaurant, it's not going to be the same way that I ate it growing up. So for me, that is why I make it. Yeah, I guess I just had an appreciation for food and different flavors since I was quite young. And yeah, I've had that hobby since then.
So moving on to family side, you mentioned cooking with your mom and stuff. And I know even during the program, you would go down to Detroit, I think it was, to visit some sort of family there. Being away from Lebanon, but also away from your family, how do you manage that? And what role does your family play in your life?
I have two sisters that live abroad and a brother and a sister that live in Lebanon. The sister that lives in the US, so this is the one I used to visit. She lives in a suburb of Detroit. So my parents would visit a lot. So I would go down to see them. So that was really helpful. Like see them and stay connected and all of that. My mom would come at least 2 years and my dad twice every year, sorry. My dad would come once a year. And I went back to Lebanon once since. And I was supposed to go back this summer. But yeah, I stay connected with them, like the phone calls, videos, pictures. I have a lot of nephews and nieces as well. So like I get a lot of pictures of them as well, which is nice. We reconnect when I visit. Mostly I've been doing the visits because it's easier for me to go.
I guess I wanted to also know along similar lines, but just moving cities, moving from your home country to, I've moved a few times, but I've always found it's a very tough challenge. So, how do you make yourself feel at home in a new city, and how do you deal with any sort of feelings of like loneliness that might come about?
That's a very interesting question, actually, because when I moved to Montreal, I didn't really think about that question. I was like, I'm excited. I'm starting this program. It's a new chapter, all of that. Didn't really think about it. Got into the program with people that were in a similar situation. So that was kind of a good buffer. We had a similar schedule, all of that. That really helped because you had people to hang around with and there was a lot of things to explore. So that was fun. And then I started making a few friends there. I was like, okay, program is done. I started looking for a job. I found a job here. I was like, okay, time to move. Let's do this again. And I thought it was going to be very easy and I was wrong. And I also moved to like a suburb. Mississauga is a city, but it's still like, it's a suburb and it's very far from downtown Toronto. And all of my friends were in downtown Toronto. Sorry, another key difference is that I didn't move for school. I moved for work. 4:30 when my job's done. And I was living very close to work. So I would walk over and I was like, okay, this is it. What do I do now? So I had a lot of empty time. I was also far away from friends and it wasn't the easiest commute and I didn't have a car and all of that. That's when I realized like, oh shit, like moving is not that easy. There are certain things that you leave behind. But luckily for me, those like my Montreal friends also moved to Toronto. That really helped. One of the things I learned is the importance of starting relationships and friendships, but also maintaining them and how you do that in a new city when you don't necessarily have the same support system that you would normally have. So I think that's one of the biggest takeaways. But then moving, like I don't think moving from Mississauga to Toronto really counts. I was just moving closer to where I knew people, so that was easier. And I realized from a more professional aspect, what really makes a city, the little things that you miss if you're someone who's like very urban. Mississauga is great if you want to raise two kids. Like it has great schools, great roads, very comfortable lifestyle. But if you're a single individual that's wanting to make friends and like having kind of an urban life, it's just not for you. And then although their city is trying to make it more livable and more attractive to young people, there are other aspects to city building that makes it appealing. So that was also interesting to see what makes a city urban. And you can't design for that. It has to come from within. So you can plan for a coffee shop. You can create incentives for businesses to start, but it's not necessarily the easiest thing to happen.
When you're in Montreal, at least you were in the program and like everyone was kind of in a similar situation of having moved and whatever, and then you made your way to Toronto and you kind of had to readjust and figure out, find your people. Or you said people, they also moved with you kind of, but like how did you cope with that? Like, you must have had some times where you're feeling lonely or you're feeling like kind of out of place. How do you build those connections in like a new place?
The thing about in Montreal is not just people like being in a similar situation, it's also that school takes up a lot of your time. So you could be on a Tuesday at 8 p.m. working or doing a reading or working on a paper that's due tomorrow. But with work, it's like 4:30, that's done. So there's like this clear distinction between work and life, which I was aware of, but wasn't really fully aware of until I experienced it. But in terms of coping with being alone or loneliness to some extent, one of the ways actually is cooking. Like we talked about cooking earlier. It's a hobby that takes a lot of time. So that was one of the ways I would cope. But then you can reconnect with people in different ways. That is also very helpful. But then there are these kind of like important relationships where you meet up with people. You kind of get to know each other more, have similar lived experiences together. And I realized when you're new to a place, it's kind of your responsibility to initiate things and maintain them. Let's say a group of friends have been friends for for a long period of time. It's hard for them not to factor you in, but you have to invest in that relationship and make sure you maintain it. It's obviously mutual. You can't force anything. Yeah, you have to be a bit more proactive about things because sometimes not everyone puts a lot of effort or we take things for granted.
So it's a big thing then. It is like those friendships and those connections, like that's can get you maybe out of the feelings of loneliness. Are there other like things in like the spatial world that you look to or that you build connections kind of in your environment too? Or is that less of a thing? Like, oh, I go to this coffee shop all the time. I feel like it's kind of
Oh, yeah.
familiar, or like I go to the park.
100%. So this is one of the things that I also missed while living in Mississauga or not living in a city or having access to so many parks or so many public spaces. It's like I could only go to the mall, because that was the only thing that was available. When you're in a city, and I remember when I was in Montreal, it happened more than once. And even when I was in New York, because I was there for a long period of time, I didn't know anyone necessarily there. I remember like something as simple as going to a park, just seeing people, seeing that really animates, or even just walking down the street. It really creates kind of an activity for you to do. It's something entertaining. That's another important aspect of being in a city as well, or a very important component of urban life that I, for example, I was taking for granted when I was living in Montreal, or even when I was living in Beirut. I never really knew what North American suburbia is like until I lived it, which is still like an interesting experience. And also seeing how that suburb is trying to change into a city, which is what's so interesting about Mississauga, or was interesting about living in Mississauga, but more working there, just seeing that kind of transformation.
I know you mentioned this earlier. Once you started kind of working out, going to the gym, food had this other importance to it as kind of fuel for you. And I also like to do a lot of exercise or physical activity. And I find sometimes struggles in terms of motivation and on kind of a day-to-day basis. How do you approach going to the gym or working out, and what keeps you motivated daily to do these things to better yourself?
At the beginning, it was hard to maintain, but I made sure it was part of my schedule, and then it became a habit. When I would stop, it'd feel odd. That's another coping mechanism. It's just working out and letting physical activity being a channel to like output stress or loneliness or whatever you're feeling. It's a very good way to reset, and it feels good afterwards. When you're starting, though, it does not. I remember like when I first started working out properly, it was when I started working, when everything was very well structured. I would wake up in the morning, have like everything ready, just go before work. And I had the added incentive of avoiding traffic. So that was why I would wake up early, to save time. So I was like, instead of spending 40 minutes in traffic, because there's a lot of traffic in Beirut, I'm going to wake up a bit early and then avoid the traffic and spend that time at the gym doing something healthy. And then, it became kind of something that I'm just so used to doing. Then the pandemic happened and then gyms were closed. And it was still a bit cold at the beginning, so I had to start looking for ways to stay active. And I realized its importance then, because I was having like this cabin fever of being home all the time. When I did this physical activity, I was like, oh wow, like this really does affect my mental health so much. And it's because of that reward that I keep going. I don't necessarily always have the same energy for it, or I don't necessarily always see the same results I'm expecting. But that reward of going every time is good enough.
The beforehand, you don't have the motivation, but you know coming out of it that I'll feel better, or this will actually kind of help me in the long term. So that can kind of get you through it too, I think. Moving on to creativity, I mentioned kind of in the intro being a bit inspired by a lot of the stuff you were doing visually. I know you're pretty talented at this. I'm interested in kind of how your creativity comes about, or what inspires your creativity, because I think I was talking to someone else too about it, and they were saying it's kind of like I get it from all these things in my daily life, in a film or in a poster, or even for me from like cities or environments. Those inspire me. So what about you? Like, what sort of things inspire you or push you to have a creative output?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if there's one specific kind of source of inspiration. For me, the process in itself is, of any creative process or endeavor, that process in itself is really interesting. And it depends what you're doing. For example, like I was designing a poster for work the other day, or I was looking at different things. And then when I started getting into it, kind of seeing it develop, that really is interesting. You might struggle at a certain point and then you look for inspiration and you see what's out there. And it's not a kind of a muse that just finds me. It's more when I'm doing something and I have this process to do, where am I struggling? Where do I need inspiration?
Going through the process, I guess you can kind of get almost inspired by yourself if you're like, okay, I'm making this, and then it turns into something and you're like, oh, well, I could actually do this.
More frequently in like with recipes or now with kombuchas, like I go on Reddit and I see different people doing different things. Like, oh, this is really inspiring. I want to try that. Being curious is what really makes you try different things and makes you experiment. And then you get yourself in the middle of it, it's like, okay, I need to figure this out.
Yeah, because ultimately, even though you saw it on Reddit, this guy did this thing, once you do it yourself or you have the challenge or curiosity of like undertaking it, it becomes something else too. Like I believe that kind of everyone has a different, even if they're inspired by something directly, like the output will still be very different.
Especially for things that you do over time. So like, for example, bread. When I baked my first sourdough loaf, it was shit. And it's the same process every time. So I use the same recipe, same everything. Then I start tweaking it and seeing how that affects the final result. That makes it, for me, something that I would want to do again. Toy around with this process and see the output, and then seeing how every time I learn something new and something better comes out every time. That I go online and I see someone doing something with their bread. It's like, oh, like I want to try to achieve that. That kind of motivates me to like do something new. But then when I'm doing it, it's a new process because, like you said, it's going to be different. I'm working under different conditions. I have a different perspective on things. I might change it.
Do you enjoy having a process the same every time? And in terms of routine too, how do you approach that, like your day and like structuring your day? Is that an important part for you, or do you change it up sometimes too? Like how do you go about having a routine, but also leaving way for other things to happen, right?
I definitely like prefer things structured. I've probably talked about this, like a process and a structure and a system. It's just how my brain works. Sometimes things happen out of the blue, like you can't plan everything. You can plan for things and you can structure things in a certain way, but know that it won't necessarily work. That's another thing that is helpful, because if you're trying to structure everything, it becomes very tiring because you want to control everything. Want 1 + 1 to equal 2, but it's not always the case. It's good to plan things and structure things, but also know that things can have a life of their own, and then you should, based on that, adjust. I like things structured though, regardless of that.
So you pretty much have like a set routine to your days that you follow?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah, or a rough routine. I don't always wake up at the same time. When I was going to the office, I had to. Now I have more flexibility. So sometimes my mornings are different, but my afternoons usually are very structured. I finish work at 4:35, I have the gym, I have to come back home, make dinner. But sometimes things happen, like sometimes I'm hanging out with a friend, sometimes I'm doing something different. Having structure helps with habits and things that you want to do or maintain. But yeah, like not always following the structure. Sometimes I get lazy, sometimes I waste time. I'm not that disciplined.
More broadly too, of like planning and like the future and all this, seems like, to me at least, right, you went kind of straight from the program and then you already had some sort of job like lined up. Was that something, obviously you kind of planned that, I guess, but how do you plan these bigger decisions or these bigger life decisions? What timescales do you think in? Like, are you thinking of your future in like a month or in like a year or 5 years? Or
with work, it was like finding a job after school was, I started doing that very early and it was very quick. I didn't necessarily have that plan, but it just worked out that way. And because it happened too quickly, I had to make some compromises, like choosing where to live, even starting too early. Like I could have easily just like took a month off. Sometimes that pressure to have things too structured doesn't work well. And sometimes you can plan things for like 5-year terms and all that, but you realize that's not how life works. You can have certain ambitions, certain goals that I want to do this, or I want to end up here in 5 years or in a year. But honestly, I'm very aware that this is not how things happen, because I've made plans that didn't work. I know where I want to be. This is what I'm doing now, but let's see what happens. That's kind of my approach. I don't have like a very accurate 5-year or 1-year plan. I'm more about just day to day and kind of like, I think I want to get there. But with work, it's different, because when you're in university, it's clear, like in 2 years, I'm going to graduate. This is the first step that I'm going to go through. But when with work, is like, okay, I'm working now. I don't know till when. It's good now. You know, it's a different process. So you have to keep yourself in check to know where you're going. But it's not the easiest thing to do either.
yeah, exactly. Like, how do you approach your future? Like, how do you know you have some sort of guiding thing that you like dream of, or what keeps you kind of moving forward?
I know where I want to be eventually, like in terms of like career and all of that. I feel what I'm doing now contributes to it. But if I'm comfortable in a situation, it's hard to think about changing it. I don't know. It's easy to get complacent while you're working. That's another thing. Many people have a lifetime of work and then they realize in their like 40s or if it's like, oh, this is not the career I wanted because time went by so quickly. Honestly, I don't know how you keep yourself in check when you become so complacent or when you tend to be complacent. I always talk with my friends about this. I feel like I should be doing something else, but what is that something? Is it something that I should be doing now?
Yeah, I have that kind of a similar fear though of just getting into a state of like complacency or comfort. I think it is healthy sometimes too to step out of that. And even on the podcast, I talked to one of my friends. He almost kind of puts himself into like discomfort to push him to do more and do other things. What are your aspirations?
From a career perspective, I'm doing urban design now, but because it's a municipal context, it's closer to the development process. And this is something I've always been interested in. Not just architecture, but how you get a building built in that process. So like from a long-term career perspective, I want to do more kind of a managerial role in that process, whether it's in the private or the public sector, I don't know. Honestly, like looking back from a year almost when I started until now, so much has changed from my own perspective. And I've learned so much about the industry. It's hard to make a 5-year plan or a 2-year plan because there might be pieces of information that come in along the way. I always feel like I want to end in that direction. That's kind of from a professional perspective. But then another part of me is like, honestly, I don't want to do this. I want to prioritize other things. I've always been interested in food. How can I make something out of it? Is it something that's secondary? Is it something that I do on the side? Or is it something that I do full time? Or is it just a hobby that I enjoy? And if I try to make something else out of it, it's going to become very boring. Yeah, it's interesting to see like friends having that same conversation when having the same kind of thought, like, okay, what am I doing now? Is this the job that I want? Do I want to do something on my own? Even within the field itself, like it's not necessarily about doing something with your hobby. It's an interesting question. And maybe that's one way of avoiding being complacent and keeping yourself in check. Or it could be like your friend being very proactive about it and be like, I want to put myself in uncomfortable situations.
The pandemic too, for me at least, gave me that space and that time to like really think, okay, what do I want to be spending my time doing and what do I want to put time into? I kind of have the ability to choose anything, and life is more than just work too. It's like it's this whole thing. It's everything. And so, and that's kind of part of the guiding of this podcast too, is understanding or trying to get an idea from people, you know, not just the work side and how they got there, but how they manage their whole life. There's a lot of other things involved, and people are not just one thing. And
when I started working after undergrad, like I also had the grad school step ahead. It felt like I was working towards that. But now that that's done, you're starting another phase. And I feel like that's a very important question to ask yourself is like, what am I doing next? What is the next step for me? But then also maybe it's too soon to ask. So definitely something to figure out. Keep questioning, because if you don't keep questioning it, you'll get complacent.
I guess I wanted to just kind of wrap things up, and maybe you could just share some either links or some projects you've worked on, or what can people check out if they want to learn more about you or what you do.
I have my website. I was thinking of adding like my cooking to it because I think that's adding that personal component to it, but it's not there yet. There's QUMI Beirut, which is also like an interesting project that I'm interested in. I'm hoping it develops into something more long term. Yeah, there's my Instagram as well. Like I have some pictures of food there.
So the links for that, the website's your name, so Ayman Jalloul.
It's aymanjalloul.com. And then QUMIBeirut.com is a project that, like the fundraiser for Beirut that me and my friends started.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how that develops too, and I think it's really cool. So I just wanted to end and thank you for coming on.
My pleasure, and thanks for inviting me and having me over.